When Games Workshop released what dispositions Gladius and Wrath were, I had but one simple response to the community.
Look how they massacred my boy.
So if you've been looking into 11th edition as closely as I've been, you've probably noticed that Gladius and Wrath aren't really where people are looking at the moment. And that's a little bit disappointing because of course they were our strongest detachments in 10th edition. It was the ones that we as Dark Angels players had the most success with. And let's be honest, Wrath of the Rock absolutely scamming people by being -1 to wound was one of the most hilarious mechanics known to man. So it's a little bit of a shame that we're no longer seeing these detachments as much in 11th. Is that more because people are getting hyped over the new one detachment point detachments? Are there other reasons that people think that maybe Gladius and Wrath are not really keeping up with the new boys? We're going to solve those problems here and really deep dive into those critical decisions on why maybe Gladius and Wrath are worth it or not. So let's dive straight into it. Gladius and Wrath are both 3 detachment points. Now what that means is that they use your full allocation of detachment points when you are selecting your detachments. Now others like the Headhunters or perhaps the Inner Circle Task Force, they're both 2 detachment points and they support a lot of your army, or you get the slightly more narrow 1-point detachment points like the Plasma detachment or the Ravenwing Flyers detachment that we have access to. So it's plenty of different things that you can combine, combo, and really use to go to that next level. But the best detachments of 10th edition read Gladius, Wrath of the Rock, best, and Blade of Ultramar, all those kinds of detachments, they are currently 3 detachment points. Now what that also means is they are locked into a certain disposition. When you're selecting your detachments, each one of those detachments plays a slightly different primary game. Now with the 3 detachment points detachments, trying to say detachments any more times, Toby, you will find that you are locked into a certain disposition. And that can be good, that can be bad. It's usually meant to be something that is quite thematic and will really support you going through that process. And that is usually positive. However, I think they've also used it as a balancing tool to make sure that detachments that are potentially a little bit better than others are not going to be as abusable. Now, priority assets is the disposition that both Wrath of the Rock and Gladius are locked into. Now, usually priority assets is a very good disposition. It's got lots of good ways to interact with your opponent. It pushes them towards the mid board. There's lots of good reasons of why you might pick it. And if you want to hear more of them, do check out my video on disposition selection and the tier list for Dark Angels. However, when it comes to Space Marines and particularly Dark Angels, we are a hyper elite army. We don't want to be spending lots of our units' activations on doing actions, and that's what priority assets does. It focuses you in on doing lots of primary actions, and that can be a little bit problematic when you have quite a low unit count. And that's really something that we want to avoid as Dark Angels players. We've always pushed forward with quite expensive units that are able to get lots of bang for their buck. I've said a couple of times previously that if Wrath of the Rock was taken hold, then this is an entirely different conversation. And I truly believe if Games Workshop want Wrath of the Rock to be a thing, they should either change it to be 2 detachment points or they should make it take and hold. I think that is probably the fairest way that they can do it, because at the moment, the big sign says no. The 2 best attachments we had are simply not worth it. But I really want to break that down, go into the minutiae of why that might be true or not. Because these hot takes simply aren't useful right now. It's more important that we get into it and really try and analyze the tactics that you'll have to use and if there is a way that you can make it work. Not all dispositions are equal, and there's quite a bit of rock, paper, scissors going on which ones will be better and which ones will suffer in this meta. There are ways that you can counteract that with your list building and really throw a spanner in the works. So We're going to try and get to the bottom of that and work out really how you can either make Gladius and Wrath work, or is it even worth bothering? So I do want to start with the positives of what's looking good from taking both priority assets and Gladius and Wrath the Rock. I don't think if you are a returning player that we need to spend too much time going over why Gladius or why Wrath of the Rock are quite good detachments. They kind of speak for themselves after you play a few games. Gladius just has every single tool available that you need to ensure you can be in the right place at the right time, along with a really solid suite of strats. And then, of course, Wrath of the Rock is just incredibly survivable, taking alongside Lion and Aggression and several other impactful strats. I really like Wrath of the Rock. It was probably my second favourite way to play Dark Angels in the last edition, narrowly behind Stormlance. But I think that Wrath is probably the best 3 detachment point detachment available to Dark Angels, exclusively because it's the only one. So let's jump into it. Priority assets does actually focus around pushing your opponent into the center. Now, Wrath of the Rock has always been a detachment that wants your opponent to come to it, and it's looking to try and get them in that critical 6-inch measurement towards those models so it can really take advantage of Lion and Aggression. Now, of course, now every faction has access to the new Lion and Aggression heroic intervention. That is going to be something that players are going to get used to a lot more. However, I think the fact that we've got Lion and Aggression for 1 CP instead just means that we're doing it for half the cost of every other opponent, and that's going to support our CP economy, which is very positive. Now, with assets as well, one of the big things that comes from this mission is it's very good at scoring primary. As long as you have the units to complete your actions, which is a large caveat, it's very difficult to not score 45 on primary if you aren't being bullied off the board. Now, that really does support you in terms of focusing on your plan and then going to interrupt your opponent. And if you are able to have a single turn where you interrupt your opponent, because of how consistent you are at scoring that primary, it is likely you will win that game. It's why priority assets is kind of being billed as one of the more positive dispositions that can really support you going forward. Unfortunately for us, it is very action heavy, but we'll come on to that shortly and why that might be its downfall. Overall, you have widely positive matchups against some of the best dispositions being used. And I think as things boil down and people start to work out what dispositions they favour, I think priority assets is going to be one of those that comes out a little bit more on top as well, because I think it's got games into the dispositions that are a little bit better in general and have better matchups across the board. Your disruption or your recon, those are some of the matchups that I think are actually really solid for priority assets. The only one that's really quite bad is Purge the Foe. That is always going to be a very tough matchup, and I think we will see a lot of Purge the Foe to kick off this edition, but equally I think there will also be a reasonable amount of it dropping off as we go, because a lot of the other dispositions don't demand you to go into the center, while as priority assets wants you in the center and it drags your opponent into the center with that asymmetric primary mission too. Purge the Foe wants you to be there so it can kill you. That's where things get a little bit problematic, but that's not what we're focusing on. Overall, I think there's some really good play that you can use from priority assets to ensure that you're getting positive matchups into most dispositions. And I think the more popular that non-Purge the Foe dispositions are, the better that priority assets will be. So you've got to think of this as a bit of a meta hot take as well. If you're expecting a ton of Purge the Foe, priority assets and Gladius or Wrath the Rock is probably not the correct choice for you. However, if you aren't expecting as much Purge the Foe, if people are more focused on disruption or on reconnaissance, then this is a far stronger disposition to take. And at that point, these detachments play themselves into the argument. And I think that's a really healthy way of looking at it, because we've got to try and be conscious of this rock, paper, scissors. It's not as clear cut as that, but there will be small advantages that you can gain in singles by picking the right disposition for the field. But there are several problems. The main one being that there are a considerable number of actions that you need to do every single turn. You cannot play the army light on units. And the way that we have consistently wanted to play is with a limited number of units. Now, it is going to get a little bit easier in regards to this because obviously we did have 315 points tied up in the Lion a lot of the time, or we had 750 points tied up in 15 Deathwing Knights. Now I think because those units are slightly weaker in 11th edition, particularly unfortunately the Lion, unless we get some changes to him, we're unlikely to be taking 750 points worth of Deathwing Knights or 315 points worth of the Lion. I think maybe 1 to 2 units of Deathwing Knights, more likely. However, with the now tax, if you take all 3, that's when things might start getting problematic. We'll have to wait and see if they start getting taxed at 2. They could be a unit if Games Workshop are feeling rather cruel, but equally, with the recent article breaking down points, I think we may see a reduction in slow melee, which does include Deathwing Knights. But we have more drops available now, and I think that's a good thing. However, we are going to need those drops. And Space Marines in general are not a cheap army. We aren't an army where we can split a squad of Cabalites or a squad of Witches or drop in a 50-point unit of Cultists to be able to go and do those actions. And that's going to be problematic. If we're trading reasonable resources at that 80 to 100 point mark consistently, just so that we can get our primary, those trade downs are going to hit you hard and fast because that's still between 5% and slightly under 5%, I don't know maths, of your army. And that's going to be a little bit difficult for you to consistently tank and still interact with your opponent. It's why Purge the Foe is a particularly bad matchup, because they can just focus on killing you while you're having to focus on those actions. Speaking of killing, this edition is incredibly killy. Assets is one that really kind of focuses on scoring that primary and trying to bring your opponent into that midboard. If your opponent decides, actually, I'm going to focus on scoring in the late game and I'm just going to kill their units now, that is going to give them a huge advantage. And now with the change to how secondaries work, where you can hold on to cards as long as you want, that is going to mean that people are scoring a lot more points later in the game. You only have to watch a game of take and hold playing to see them suddenly score 45 points on their primary over the last 3 turns, and suddenly their opponent is blown out of the water. It is crazy how easy it is to do that, and it's really worth bearing in mind that towards the end of that game, that's when things might slip. So if your opponent's just focusing on killing you, that's where priority assets may come into problems. And this disposition is probably pretty weak to Purge the Foe. I think that people will default to that, as we've kind of already covered. But equally, is it overall a good disposition? That remains to be seen. I'm trying it tonight for the first time, so I'll be able to give it a little bit more of an understanding and maybe try and see if there is a particular strength to it. But equally, I think its ability to just focus on killing and not worry about actions is quite nice. It's something that maybe Dark Angels want to do, but equally, we are a little bit slow for it if we're not taking the Raven Wing. So it'll be interesting to see, but equally, because we have to be in the middle board to do our assets missions, that's exactly where our Purge the Foe opponent wants us, because that's when they can then come and kill us. And obviously, if we're in the mid board against any kind of disposition, if someone is taking a particularly killy army, and quite frankly, everyone is taking a particularly killy army at the moment, that's when things can get a little bit dicey and a little bit awkward, because if you don't have enough resources, or if you just have one swing down on a little bit of luck, and a unit that you weren't expecting to die dies, that's where things can go pear-shaped. So let's dive a little deeper into the detachments themselves and what makes Gladius and Wrath of the Rock either good or bad. And we're going to kick off with Gladius because it is the oldest detachment that we have available. It was the original 10th edition index detachment, and I really want to talk about it and break down why I think actually maybe it's still not quite there in 11th edition, at least for Dark Angels. I think there will definitely be builds for other Marine factions that can use Gladius. I think for us, possibly not. And I think that does surround the kind of the way that we used to play it in 10th edition. I think there may be a build, but right now I don't see it personally. The old Gladius trick really feels weaker than it once was. we don't have that linchpin of the Lion plus Deathwing Knights with the gunline backup. It just doesn't feel it took a nerf in every single area. The Lion was made weaker, slow melee was made weaker, and then hazardous changes have hamstrung the land speed of vengeance as well. It's made it really difficult to like keep that list going in a more efficient and positive way. But there are still some positives. They do have a really nice ability to strip cover and add AP to their shots. Now, the ability to strip cover in 11th edition is really important. It's a lot more prevalent than we've seen in 10th, but if you're able to take away that -1 to hit and then add AP, AP is so much more impactful now. So all of our plasma and things like that, if they're firing at things that do not have invulnerable saves, we are in a very nasty position. Those 3-up saves, if you strip cover and add the AP, they're being shot by plasma, will no longer get a save. That is a dead marine for every wound, and you are wounding on 2s and hitting on 3s if you're stripping cover first as well. I think it will come down to points on this one. If marines in general go down enough points, then there is still scope. Will Dark Angels be the build for Gladius if that is the case? It's very hard to say, and I think the answer is probably no. I think we will miss out to an Ultramarine or one of the other Codex compliant chapters, and that's going to be a little bit of a shame because Gladius was always a good, fun one to play. But equally, I don't think it is now a positive way that you can play Dark Angels. I think there's a lot more better ways that you can more efficiently do it, unless there are some significant points drops around Deathwing Knights and the Lion. And then, sure, maybe with the changes to them, the speed, you can get there. It might be good enough at that point. But right now, I don't see it, which is slightly disappointing because I did always enjoy that Gladius build. Overall, I think Gladius, between being priority assets and the triple nerf that the way that we were playing Gladius has taken, I feel like it's a little bit dead. And I haven't even touched on one of the other major nerfs for Gladius, which was it was a 2-up save stat check, and 2-up saves are really quite poor. Well, poor is unfair, but they're a lot weaker than they once were. So ultimately, no, I don't think Gladius is worth it for Dark Angels. Right now, maybe there's some wiggle room when the points come in, and you probably could still force it if you really wanted to. But if you're here, you're probably looking for more competitive tips than rather how to force a detachment to be good. But I do want to come on to something a little bit more positive, and that is Wrath of the Rock. Now, I'm going to start this with something that doesn't sound overly positive, and that is that Wrath of the Rock is slower than Gladius and usually has a far smaller model count, which is not ideal in 11th edition when we've just covered off why that could be the killer, especially with priority assets. However, Wrath of the Rock has some real good tricks that we should be able to use to benefit us as we push through this edition, namely its survivability. It's critical to use that survivability to our advantage because we are pushing into the center. We've talked about how Purge the Foe is going to target those units and focus on killing you. If we give them units that are durable and that they cannot chew through, suddenly we have a better chance of surviving and getting that 45 primary, where our opponent struggles to kill through our army and doesn't get that opportunity to score as late. Our opponent wants to come to us. They want to try and get into our face and attack our models. That is what we want as Wrath of the Rock. Therefore, with Recover, there is a little bit more play. The only problem there is that it's not as proactive as we would want it to be. They're not able to focus on killing things as much as they would be able to if it was, say, a take and hold disposition instead of an assets disposition. So it's good that Wrath of the Rock can be forcing our opponents to play in a certain fashion that benefits us. However, we do lack fallback and do things, and that is quite problematic because if our opponent is able to tag up most of our models, suddenly we're not going to be able to do those actions. It's going to be really difficult to try and position to stop that from happening. I think there is an argument where you basically just use 2-inch engagement range to stop your opponent from ever standing on those objectives. And I think that's a really good way of kind of bullying people in 11th edition. However, That's quite tough. And with a low model count, that gets even tougher. I've seen it done with 80 berserkers and things like that in World Eaters. However, are we able to do that too? Are we fast enough to get into those positions? The jury is still very much out on that one. But I want to go over a Wrath of the Rock list. Now, this is a list that, if you've seen my lists to start 11th with, this did feature. And I really like this list. I think it's incredibly solid. I think it's got all the play that we might need to really push into our opponents and to take that mid board and dominate that board control. Now, what we're doing here is we are abusing the fact that Inner Circle companions have an innate -1 to hit as part of their datasheet ability. Now, with the change to cover, modifying ballistic skill down by 1, that suddenly makes life a lot more hard if your opponent wants to shoot your Inner Circle companions. The average Marine is hitting an Inner Circle companion on a 5 when they have cover, which is absolutely brilliant. What I've also done in this is given each block of ICCs a character that is going to give them a 4-up invuln. So we've got Azrael with 6 Inner Circle companions, an Ancient Weapons Librarian, because that can get to damage 4 with 6 Inner Circle companions, and then finally just a Librarian with 6 Inner Circle companions. Now, there is an argument to bring an Impulsor along with this to make sure that we get that delivery system. However, I'm less worried about that, I think would be the phrase I would use, because the Inner Circle companions actually just want to go and sit on those objectives. If we need to be a little bit faster, it's a solid little action piece, so don't rule out the Impulsor immediately. Next, we've got the Lieutenant with Combi Weapon. This guy is absolutely essential because we need someone that can forward deploy, do our actions, and get out of dodge if he needs to. Reactive moves are even better than they were in 10th edition, so I've got a massive feeling that the Combi Lieutenant will be seen a lot more unless Games Workshop decide to up his points even higher. Next, we've got Samael with 3 Outriders. Now, the reason that I've got these guys is because I like Samael having that 3 damage output. I think that's really solid. What I also like is the triple Outriders there, giving him that little bit more of a safety buff. The 4 wounds that they bring per model is very good to stay alive and keep causing trouble. But Samael equally is going to make sure that we have access to advance and do stuff and fall back and do stuff, which is critical for the reasons that we discussed over the last slide. Samael also got a little bit of a glow up with his ability. Opponents are going to be battle shocked a lot more of the time. So if they're taking a hazardous check, they are now hazardous checking on 1s, 2s, and 3s. Obviously, Desperate Escape is now worse into multi-wound models, but if you take something like a big blob of Guardsmen or a big blob of Votan Terminators, all that kind of stuff, that's dying quite quickly if it is having to do its Desperate Escape and failing on 1s, 2s, and 3s. Next, we've got some Intercessors. Now, they are just a score. We want to be able to sticky our home objective and then push out. Next, we've got 2 Land Speed of Vengeances and a Thunderstrike. Now, that package is there because we need something that can deal with the problems at range that might bother our Inner Circle companions. We want that speed. We want to be able to dictate that pace of the game and get our opponent into a position where we can hit them even harder. Now, with towing into ruins now, the LSV has only improved. I really rate the LSV right now. Obviously, it did take a slight nerf with the change to hazardous. It's why I really like it in Darkflight, because obviously it can reroll its hazardous. However, it is still an incredibly strong bit of kit. Next, we've got some scouts. Those scouts exclusively, again, we want to infiltrate them forward in those positions to start our primary game rolling. We cannot trip up on primary. It is so critical that you know that at this point, that we do not want to fall behind on primary. Priority Assets is one of those missions where if you can get ahead, and you are more than likely to stay ahead. And that is a very important way to play in 11th edition. Next, we've got a squad of Suppressors, which you may have not seen for a very long time. Now, the reason that Suppressors are a lot better in 11th edition is, again, the same reason that we are abusing Inner Circle companions. They dish out a -1 to hit debuff on an enemy unit after they've shot it. That is then going to combo with cover and mean that most Marines are hitting on 5s rather than 3s, which is quite impactful. Suppressors also have several other little boosts. They've got the smoke keyword, which can be really useful in protecting the units behind you by giving them the cover keyword, which again combos very nicely with their -1 to hit. They're a 12-inch moving marine, they're fast, they're efficient, and then also their guns got significantly better because -1 AP had a massive boost from the change to cover. I think these guys are really good. They can also take advantage of heavy. The only downside that I find with these guys is that if they move their full 12 and they shoot at a unit in cover, they are hitting on 5s, and that is a little bit sketchy. So that is something to bear in mind, but for 75 points, I think they do a really solid job. Finally, we've got 3x5 Shield Vang Vets, and they are ultimately there because we need to score those points. They are there because they are survivable, they're good at going out and doing secondaries, they're good at going out and doing your primaries. It's really important that we identify those key units to do it. But unfortunately, we are taking a 100-point unit to go and do it. And we don't have confirmation yet if we will still be able to take Shield Vanguard Vets. I do think we will, and I don't think that is something that will change. However, it could. And that is a little bit worrying because I think Wrath of the Rock, that would probably be a final death now. If Wrath of the Rock can't take Shield Van Vets, I think that might be it because they've always been so good at scamming people and going out and scoring those secondaries because they're so quick. I've always been very impressed with them. They've got access to Leon and aggression, all that good stuff. And that 4-up invuln pushes them to the next level, especially in this new, quite high AP because of the change to cover that we are likely to see. So, is Wrath of the Rock worth it? I think so. There is still scope. I don't think it's the best way to play Dark Angels, but I also don't think it's terrible. Gladius, I would say, is one that I would avoid personally. Wrath of the Rock with this interesting stat check is something that you can still take and explore those options as you go through. That would be my advice. I think Wrath of the Rock has that potential and it's worth another look at the very least. Of course, most people are going to get distracted by the new shiny stuff, and why wouldn't they? I have myself. But good old Wrath of the Rock is here, and hopefully it will be here to stay because of the beauty that is Inner Circle Companions. If you want to learn more about 11th edition and how Dark Angels play in 11th edition, make sure you're subscribing below because you don't want to miss out on any more of this content as you break through and start getting more games of 11th. I've gone through so many different rules and so many different lists and so many different tests just so I can bring you this content. So hopefully it'll be really nice and useful, and if you're not subscribed, you're going to miss some of it. So make sure you're sorting that, join in the Discord and ring that bell so you're always getting a notification when we post. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, stay loyal, brothers.